The laughter erupted across the packed community center auditorium like a wave of cruelty. Margaret Chen stood at the podium, her weathered hands gripping the edges as the city council members exchanged smirks behind their nameplates. "You want to allocate emergency funds for weeds?" Councilman Richards bellowed, his voice dripping with mockery. "Lady, we've got real problems in this city. Crumbling infrastructure, budget deficits, and you're here talking about dandelions and wild herbs?" The crowd of concerned citizens who had packed the meeting to discuss the city's mounting environmental crisis joined in the derision. Someone in the back shouted, "Go back to your flower shop, plant lady." Margaret's eyes swept across the room, taking in the faces twisted with amusement at her expense. She had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing this presentation, gathering research, documenting the medicinal properties of native flora that grew wild throughout Phoenix Valley. Now as phone cameras captured her humiliation for social media. Mockery, she felt the familiar sting of being dismissed as the eccentric woman who talked to plants. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret's fingers unconsciously moved to the small silver locket at her throat, feeling the outline of the pressed violet inside. It had been her grandmother's, a reminder of wisdom passed down through generations of women who understood that nature held secrets most people chose to ignore. As the council moved to dismiss her proposal without a vote, Margaret gathered her folders of carefully documented research and walked toward the exit. The whispers followed her down the aisle. "Plant mom strikes again," someone muttered. "Crazy Margaret and her weed collection," added another voice. She had heard these labels countless times over the past 5 years since moving to Phoenix Valley, but tonight they cut deeper than usual. The small city of Phoenix Valley, nestled in the Sierra Nevada foothills of Northern California, prided itself on being progressive and environmentally conscious. Solar panels dotted rooftops, electric vehicle charging stations lined the downtown core, and the farmers' market drew visitors from neighboring counties every weekend. Yet beneath this green facade lay a community that valued appearance over substance, quick fixes over deep understanding. Margaret had learned this lesson repeatedly since opening Wildroot Botanicals, her small herbal shop on the outskirts of town's historic district. At 42, Margaret possessed the kind of quiet intensity that made people uncomfortable. Her dark hair, streaked with premature silver, was usually pulled back in a practical bun, and her clothes bore the permanent stains of soil and plant matter. She lived alone in a modest craftsman bungalow that she had inherited from her great-aunt, transforming the backyard into what neighbors called an unruly jungle, but what Margaret knew to be a carefully cultivated ecosystem of medicinal plants. Her property stood out like a wild anomaly among the manicured lawns and geometric flower beds that defined her residential street. Margaret's journey to becoming the town's unofficial plant expert had begun in childhood. Raised by her Korean immigrant grandmother in San Francisco's Richmond district, she had spent countless hours in the tiny backyard garden learning to identify plants by touch, smell, and the subtle energy they emanated. Her grandmother, Halmoni, had been a traditional healer in Seoul before immigrating to America, carrying with her generations of botanical knowledge that Western medicine often dismissed as folklore. "Plants speak to those who listen," Halmoni would whisper as they worked side by side in the small plot behind their apartment building. But most people have forgotten how to hear. After her grandmother's death when Margaret was 16, she had thrown herself into academic study, earning degrees in botany and biochemistry from UC Berkeley. Her doctoral dissertation on the pharmaceutical potential of California native plants had earned academic recognition, but little practical application. The pharmaceutical industry showed interest only in isolated compounds that could be synthesized and patented, not in the complex synergistic relationships between plants that her grandmother had taught her to understand. Disillusioned with academia's reductionist approach, Margaret had spent her 20s working for various environmental organizations, documenting biodiversity in threatened ecosystems and watching helplessly as development destroyed habitats she had spent years studying. The move to Phoenix Valley 5 years ago had been born of exhaustion and a desire to live more simply. Her great-aunt Rosemary, her grandmother's younger sister who had settled in the small mountain town decades earlier, had left Margaret the bungalow and a modest inheritance with explicit instructions to keep the old ways alive. Margaret had intended to take a year to recover from burnout, maybe write a book about medicinal plants, and figure out her next career move. Instead, she found herself putting down roots deeper than she had ever imagined possible. The transition had not been smooth. Phoenix Valley's population of 12,000 included a significant number of well-educated professionals who had moved from larger cities seeking small-town charm while maintaining urban sophistication. They embraced organic food, yoga studios, and expensive skincare products made with botanical extracts, but they viewed Margaret's actual knowledge of plants with suspicion, bordering on hostility. Her shop, Wildroot Botanicals, occupied a narrow storefront in what locals called the Crunchy part of downtown, squeezed between a crystal healing center and a store selling hand-woven textiles. Margaret's clientele consisted primarily of a handful of elderly residents who remembered when such knowledge was commonplace, a few young mothers seeking natural remedies for their children's ailments, and the occasional tourist drawn by curiosity. The bulk of the town's residents shopped at the upscale wellness boutique on Main Street, where mass-produced supplements and trendy adaptogens were sold at premium prices by staff who could recite marketing copy but knew little about the plants themselves. The dismissive attitude had crystallized around Margaret, personally after a series of unfortunate encounters during her first year in town. At a community garden meeting, she had suggested incorporating more native medicinal plants into the shared plots, only to be lectured about liability concerns and the dangers of amateur herbalism by Dr. Patricia Hawthorne, the town's most prominent physician and wife of the mayor. When Margaret had quietly mentioned that several of the decorative plants being installed in the new town square were actually invasive species that would crowd out beneficial natives, the landscape committee chair had accused her of being negative and unwelcoming to newcomers' ideas. The breaking point had come during a PTA meeting at the elementary school, where Margaret had volunteered to create an educational herb garden for the children. Her proposal had been enthusiastically received until she mentioned including plants like stinging nettle and comfrey, which she explained had important nutritional and medicinal properties when properly prepared. Dr. Hawthorne had stood up dramatically, declaring that allowing such dangerous weeds near children was irresponsible and potentially criminal. The room had erupted in concerned parent voices, and Margaret's proposal was not just rejected, but resulted in a formal letter from the school district requesting that she not volunteer for any activities involving children. These rejections had hurt, but Margaret had learned to find fulfillment in her smaller circle of supporters and in the quiet satisfaction of her work. She continued to tend her garden, expanding it each year to include more rare and endangered medicinal plants. She maintained detailed records of growing conditions, harvest times, and preparation methods, building a database that would have impressed any research institution. Her small shop provided enough income to cover her modest expenses, and she supplemented by teaching occasional workshops on plant identification and sustainable wildcrafting to the few locals who showed genuine interest. The issue that had brought her to tonight's city council meeting had emerged gradually over the past 18 months. Phoenix Valley, like many small California cities, was struggling with the environmental and economic impacts of increasingly severe wildfire seasons. The previous summer had brought the closest calls yet, with evacuations ordered for the entire eastern section of town as flames crept down from the national forest. The city's Emergency Preparedness Committee had formed in response, dominated by business leaders and retired professionals who approached the crisis with typical urban solutions: improved communication systems, evacuation route optimization, and discussions about defensible space requirements. Margaret had attended several of these meetings, listening as experts discussed fire-resistant landscaping, techniques that involved removing native vegetation and replacing it with non-flammable, but ecologically sterile alternatives. She watched presentations about air quality monitoring systems and emergency medical protocols, noting that no one seemed to consider how environmental disasters might disrupt supply chains for essential medications or how communities might need to become more self-reliant in extended crisis situations. Her decision to speak up had come after a particularly frustrating meeting, where the committee had discussed spending $50,000 on a mobile emergency communication unit while simultaneously dismissing a much smaller allocation for preserving the wetland area that served as a natural firebreak on the town's eastern border. Margaret had spent weeks researching and documenting her proposal, identifying dozens of native plants that could serve multiple functions in emergency preparedness while supporting local ecosystem health. Her presentation had been thorough and well-researched. She had documented how certain native plants could be cultivated to create natural firebreaks while simultaneously providing materials for basic medical care during emergencies when hospitals might be overwhelmed or inaccessible. She had brought samples and photographs, showing how plants like yarrow could help with wound healing, how willow bark could provide pain relief, and how native mints could serve as respiratory aids during smoke events. Her proposal requested minimal funding to create demonstration gardens that could serve as both emergency resources and educational tools for community resilience. The response had been swift and brutal. Councilman Richards had immediately dismissed her ideas as hippie nonsense, questioning whether she had any real credentials to make such recommendations. Dr. Hawthorne, who attended council meetings as a concerned citizen, had stood up to warn about the dangers of amateur herbalism and the liability issues of encouraging people to self-medicate with unknown plants. Mayor Margaret Chen, no relation despite sharing her surname, had suggested that Margaret's time might be better spent supporting proven emergency preparedness measures rather than promoting unscientific alternatives. The audience's laughter had been the final humiliation. These were her neighbors, people she saw at the grocery store and the post office, people whose children played in the parks, where she sometimes led nature walks for the handful of families who appreciated her knowledge. Their mockery felt like a rejection not just of her ideas, but of her entire way of being in the world. As Margaret walked home from the meeting, her folders of research heavy in her canvas tote bag, she felt the familiar weight of being misunderstood settling on her shoulders. The evening air carried the scent of jasmine from the well-tended gardens. She passed, a reminder of how the town valued plants only when they served decorative purposes or enhanced property values. Her own garden, with its wild profusion of useful plants, was regularly cited by the Homeowners Association as a violation of neighborhood aesthetic standards. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The criticism stung more deeply because Margaret knew her neighbors weren't entirely wrong to be skeptical. The internet was full of dangerous misinformation on herbal medicine, and she had seen too many people suffer because they trusted unqualified advice over proper medical care. Her grandmother had taught her that plant medicine was not a rejection of modern healthcare, but a complement to it, a way of supporting the body's natural healing processes while working alongside trained medical professionals. The distinction was subtle but crucial, and Margaret had spent years learning to walk that fine line between honoring traditional knowledge and respecting contemporary safety standards. Her shop reflected this careful balance. She sold only products she made herself or sourced from trusted suppliers, and she was scrupulous about providing accurate information about contraindications and potential interactions with medications. She encouraged customers to consult with Their healthcare providers and was quick to refer serious conditions to medical professionals. Her liability insurance was current, her products were properly labeled, and she maintained detailed records of everything she sold. Yet none of these precautions seemed to matter to a community that had already decided she was a dangerous eccentric. Margaret's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac where the suburban development met the edge of the national forest. The property had been her great-aunt's pride, a third of an acre that sloped gently toward a seasonal creek. Aunt Rosemary had been an artist who appreciated the wild beauty of native plants, allowing natural succession to reclaim much of the formal garden that had existed when she first bought the property in the Coffey 1980s. When Margaret inherited the land, she found it already partway toward rewilding, with native bunch grasses replacing the lawn and oak seedlings emerging from what had once been rose beds. Margaret had spent 5 years building on this foundation, carefully observing which plants thrived in different microclimates and gradually introducing species that would support both ecological diversity and human wellness. The front yard maintained enough conventional landscaping to avoid homeowners association complaints, but the backyard had been transformed into something that looked chaotic to untrained eyes but operated as a sophisticated polyculture system. Near the kitchen door, she maintained raised beds of culinary and medicinal herbs that required regular tending and harvesting. Calendula bloomed alongside basil, and feverfew shared space with rosemary in carefully planned combinations that supported each plant's growth while providing a steady supply of ingredients for her shop. Further from the house, native shrubs like elderberry and manzanita created habitat for birds while offering seasonal harvests of berries that Margaret transformed into syrups and tinctures. The back slope, where the property bordered the national forest, had been allowed to return almost entirely to native vegetation. Here, Margaret had planted or encouraged rare, medicinal species that were disappearing from the local ecosystem due to development and climate change. Ghost pipe grew in the deepest shade beneath the oaks, while patches of indigenous wild ginger carpeted areas near the seasonal stream. She had documented over 200 plant species on her property, including several that botanists considered locally extinct. This diversity was Margaret's greatest source of pride and her deepest secret. Few people understood that what looked like an overgrown backyard was actually a carefully maintained conservation sanctuary and living pharmacy. The plants she tended included species that indigenous peoples had used for thousands of years, varieties that early settlers had relied on for basic health care, and modern cultivars that represented the latest understanding of plant chemistry and therapeutic applications. Margaret's evenings were usually spent in this garden, tending to plants that needed attention, harvesting materials for her shop, or simply sitting quietly among the growing things that seemed to respond to her presence. Tonight, however, she felt too agitated to settle into her usual routines. The sting of public humiliation made it difficult to find the peace that her garden normally provided. She unlocked her front door and set down her bag of rejected research with a thud that seemed to echo through the small house. Her living room reflected the same practical aesthetic as her garden, with functional furniture chosen for comfort rather than style, and bookshelves that groaned under the weight of botanical texts, traditional medicine references, and field guides to regional flora. The walls displayed pressed flower arrangements and botanical illustrations that Aunt Rosemary had collected, creating a sense of continuity between the generations of women who had called this house home. Margaret made herself a cup of tea from herbs grown in her own garden, choosing chamomile and lemon balm to calm her nerves, and settled into the worn armchair that had been her reading spot for 5 years. The familiar ritual of preparing and drinking plant-based medicine helped center her, reminding her that her knowledge had value regardless of how others perceived it. She pulled out her phone and began scrolling through the social media posts that had already appeared from tonight's meeting. The videos were as bad as she had expected. Someone had captured the moment when Councilman Richards made his crack about weeds, and the clip was already being shared in local Facebook groups with laughing emojis and comments about crazy plant lady. Another post showed her walking out of the meeting with her folders, captioned with speculation about what kind of witchcraft manuals she had been carrying. The comments ranged from mildly mocking to genuinely cruel, with several people suggesting that someone should check on her mental health or investigate whether she was growing anything illegal on her property. Margaret set the phone aside, feeling the familiar mixture of anger and sadness that came from being so thoroughly misunderstood. She had moved to Phoenix Valley, hoping to find a community that would appreciate traditional knowledge and sustainable living practices. Instead, she had discovered that even environmentally conscious people often preferred the illusion of green, living to the actual work of building resilient local systems. The irony was not lost on her that a town full of people who paid premium prices for organic produce and natural skincare products would reject free access to the plants that provided these benefits. They wanted the outcomes of traditional plant knowledge without acknowledging the wisdom traditions that made such knowledge possible. They preferred the sanitized, commercialized versions of herbal medicine, sold in chain stores, to the actual relationships with plants that made sustainable wellness practices possible. As Margaret prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about her grandmother's stories of the early days in America, when Korean immigrants faced suspicion and discrimination for their traditional practices. Halmoni had learned to keep her plant knowledge quiet, sharing it only with family members and a small circle of trusted friends who understood its value. She had warned Margaret that Americans were often suspicious of knowledge they couldn't control or commodify, preferring to dismiss traditional practices as superstition rather than acknowledge their own ignorance. "The plants will wait," Halmoni used to say when Margaret expressed frustration about people's lack of interest in herbal medicine. "They have been here much longer than we have, and they will be here long after we are gone. Our job is to keep the knowledge alive until people are ready to listen again." Margaret fell asleep that night, wondering if people would ever be ready to listen, or if she was destined to remain an outsider in her own community, tending her secret garden while the world dismissed everything she had spent her life learning. She could not have imagined that within 6 months, the very people who had laughed at her tonight would be depending on her knowledge for their survival. The weeks following the city council meeting brought an intensification of the social isolation that Margaret had learned to navigate. Her morning walks through downtown Phoenix Valley became exercises in avoiding eye contact as former acquaintances crossed streets to avoid interaction or offered the kind of forced smiles that made their discomfort obvious. The local coffee shop where she had once enjoyed reading the newspaper became a minefield of whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered. Dr. Patricia Hawthorne seemed to have taken Margaret's council presentation as a personal challenge to her authority as the town's medical expert. During her weekly health segment on the local radio station, she began including warnings about the dangers of amateur herbalism and the importance of seeking qualified medical care for all health concerns. While she never mentioned Margaret by name, her references to unlicensed individuals dispensing medical advice and dangerous folk remedies were clearly directed at the town's most visible herbalist. The attack felt particularly unfair because Margaret had always been careful to work within appropriate boundaries. She sold teas and tinctures as dietary supplements, not medicines, and her labels clearly stated that her products had not been evaluated by the FDA and were not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. She regularly referred customers to healthcare providers for serious conditions and maintained detailed records of potential contraindications and drug interactions. Her approach was more conservative than many health food stores, but Dr. Hawthorne seemed determined to paint her as a reckless charlatan. The hostility affected Margaret's business in measurable ways. Several regular customers stopped coming to her shop, and she noticed people quickly walking past her storefront rather than browsing her window displays as they had in the past. The weekly farmers market, where she had maintained a small booth selling herbal teas and garden starts, became increasingly uncomfortable as vendors at neighboring stalls made pointed comments about liability and insurance. When the market coordinator suggested that Margaret might want to consider relocating to the craft section rather than the food and wellness area, she understood that her time at the market was ending. Margaret's response to this social ostracism was to retreat deeper into her work with plants. She spent longer hours in her garden, expanding her cultivation of rare, medicinal species and meticulously documenting their growing requirements and therapeutic properties. Her great-aunt's greenhouse, which had fallen into disrepair, became a winter project as Margaret restored the structure and installed climate control systems that would allow her to propagate sensitive species year-round. She also began reaching out beyond Phoenix Valley's borders, connecting with herbalists and botanical researchers in other regions who shared her interests in preserving traditional plant knowledge. These connections, maintained primarily through online forums and occasional conferences, provided the intellectual stimulation and professional validation that her local community seemed determined to deny her. She began contributing articles to specialized publications and participating in research projects that documented the medicinal properties of native plants. One project that occupied much of her time during this period was the creation of a comprehensive database of plants native to the Sierra Nevada foothills that had documented medicinal uses in traditional systems. Working with indigenous knowledge keepers and ethnobotanists from several universities, Margaret systematically cataloged the therapeutic applications, preparation methods, and ecological requirements of dozens of species that grew wild in the mountains surrounding Phoenix Valley. This work brought her into contact with Dr. Elena Vasquez, an ethnobotanist at UC Davis who was studying the pharmaceutical potential of California native plants. Dr. Vasquez visited Margaret's property twice during the spring, marveling at the diversity of species Margaret had successfully cultivated and the detailed records she maintained of their growth patterns and chemical constituents. The collaboration energized Margaret, reminding her that her work had scientific value even if her neighbors couldn't see it. Dr. Vasquez became particularly interested in Margaret's collection of rare mountain plants that were disappearing from their natural habitats due to climate change and development pressure. Several species that Margaret had rescued from construction sites and carefully propagated in her garden were no longer found in the wild anywhere within 100 miles of Phoenix Valley. Her property was serving as an unofficial seed bank and conservation center for plants that might otherwise have been lost entirely from the regional ecosystem. The research collaboration also led to Margaret's involvement in a multi-institutional project studying the potential of native plants to provide low-cost healthcare solutions for rural and underserved communities. The project, funded by a combination of federal grants and private foundations, aimed to identify plants that could be sustainably cultivated by community groups to address common health challenges when access to conventional medical care was limited or expensive. Margaret's contribution focused on developing cultivation protocols and preparation methods that could be safely implemented by people without extensive botanical training. She created detailed growing guides for a dozen species that showed promise for treating conditions like minor wounds, digestive issues, respiratory problems, and anxiety. Each guide included information about potential contraindications, appropriate dosage ranges, and clear instructions about when professional medical care should be sought. The work was deeply satisfying on multiple levels. It allowed Margaret to honor her grandmother's teachings about plants as allies in community health while contributing to contemporary scientific understanding of botanical medicine. It also provided documentation that could protect traditional plant knowledge from being appropriated by pharmaceutical companies that might seek to patent compounds derived from indigenous healing practices. As summer progressed, Margaret noticed changes in her local environment that worried her more than the social isolation she had learned to navigate. The seasonal creek that ran through her property, which had historically flowed until late July, dried up completely by mid-June. Spring wildflower bloom was sparse and brief, with many species flowering weeks earlier than their normal schedule. Mountain snowpack that usually provided water well into summer had melted by early May, leaving the national forest tinder dry by Independence Day. These changes affected Margaret's garden in subtle but significant ways. Plants that had thrived in previous years struggled with the earlier heat and extended dry period. Some rare species that she had carefully established began showing signs of stress despite her supplemental irrigation. The climate conditions that had made Phoenix Valley suitable habitat for certain medicinal plants seemed to be shifting faster than the plants could adapt. Margaret began adjusting her gardening practices to help her plants cope with the changing conditions. She installed shade cloth over sensitive species, modified her watering schedules, and began experimenting with mulching techniques that would help soil retain moisture longer. She also started collecting and storing seeds from plants that seemed likely to struggle in future years, creating a genetic repository that might allow for reintroduction if conditions became more favorable. The broader implications of these environmental changes extended far beyond Margaret's garden. The early snowmelt and extended dry period were creating fire conditions more severe than anything in recent memory. By July, the National Forest Service had implemented Stage 2 fire restrictions, banning all campfires and requiring permits for any kind of mechanical equipment use in forested areas. Local fire departments began conducting more frequent inspections of defensible space around residential properties, and several neighborhoods received notices about vegetation management requirements. Phoenix Valley's Emergency Preparedness Committee, the same group that had dismissed Margaret's proposal for medicinal plant gardens, now met weekly to discuss increasingly alarming reports from fire management agencies. The mountain communities to the east had already experienced 2 significant fires that required evacuations, and meteorologists were predicting that the worst fire weather was still ahead. The City Council approved emergency funding for additional water storage tanks and communication equipment, but the measures felt inadequate given the scale of the potential threat. Margaret followed these developments with growing concern, not just for the immediate fire danger, but for the broader implications of environmental instability. Her research into traditional medicine had taught her that indigenous communities had always maintained diverse healing resources specifically because they understood that normal supply chains could be disrupted by natural disasters, conflicts, or economic upheavals. Modern communities had traded this resilience for efficiency, creating systems that worked well under normal conditions, but became fragile when faced with unexpected challenges. She began thinking more seriously about the emergency preparedness applications of her plant knowledge, not as an alternative to modern medical care, but as a complement that could provide basic support when conventional resources were overwhelmed or inaccessible. Many of the plants in her garden could address common health issues that might become problematic during emergency situations: digestive problems caused by stress or unfamiliar food, minor injuries that didn't require emergency room treatment, respiratory issues caused by smoke exposure, and anxiety or sleep problems that often accompanied crisis situations. Margaret decided to create detailed emergency protocols for using common medicinal plants to address health challenges that might arise during wildfire evacuations or other disaster scenarios. She researched which plants could be quickly prepared with minimal equipment, which preparations could be safely administered to children and elderly people, and which species were most likely to remain available even if supply chains were disrupted. The project became a way of channeling her anxiety about the deteriorating environmental conditions into productive action. Even if her community continued to dismiss her knowledge, she could at least ensure that the information would be available. If circumstances forced people to reconsider their assumptions about where help might come from during a crisis. As August arrived with temperatures climbing into triple digits and humidity dropping to single-digit percentages, Margaret felt a growing sense of urgency about completing her documentation. The mountains surrounding Phoenix Valley looked like a matchstick waiting for a spark, and the daily fire weather reports painted increasingly dire pictures of atmospheric instability and extreme fire behavior potential. She worked long hours in her garden during the cooler morning and evening periods, harvesting and drying plants that might be needed for emergency use, creating tinctures and extracts that would have long shelf lives, and ensuring that her most important plant knowledge was recorded in formats that could survive even if her physical library was destroyed. Margaret had no way of knowing that her prescient preparations would soon be put to the most severe test imaginable, or that the community that had laughed at her plant knowledge would soon be depending on her garden for their survival. The fire that would transform her from town eccentric to essential resource was still weeks away, building its strength in the drought-stressed forests that surrounded their small mountain community like a slow-burning fuse approaching an explosive charge. The morning of August 15th dawned with an eerie stillness that made Margaret's skin prickle with unease. She stood in her kitchen, sipping tea made from her own peppermint while watching the thermometer on her back porch climb past 90 degrees before 7 o'clock. The air hung heavy and motionless, pressing against the earth like a held breath. Even the birds seemed subdued, their usual dawn chorus reduced to scattered, nervous chirping from the oak trees that bordered her property. Margaret had learned to read these atmospheric moods during her years in the mountains, understanding that nature provided warning signs for those who knew how to interpret them. Today felt different from the routine heat waves that had characterized the summer. The quality of light seemed wrong, filtered through a haze that wasn't quite fog and wasn't quite smoke. Her weather radio crackled with updates about a high-pressure system stalled over Northern California, creating conditions that meteorologists described with increasingly urgent terminology. She finished her tea and walked into her garden to check on the plants that were most vulnerable to heat stress. The shade cloth she had installed over her medicinal herb beds fluttered occasionally in barely perceptible air movements, but provided little relief from the oppressive atmosphere. Margaret moved through her morning routine of watering and harvesting with practiced efficiency, but she found herself hurrying more than usual, driven by an instinct that warned of approaching danger. The emergency radio in her greenhouse had been broadcasting fire weather warnings since before dawn, reporting red flag conditions across the entire Sierra Nevada region. Relative humidity was expected to drop below 10%, while temperatures climbed toward record-breaking levels. The combination created what fire officials called explosive fire growth potential, meaning that any ignition could rapidly develop into a major conflagration. Margaret had been monitoring these conditions for weeks, watching as the forest surrounding Phoenix Valley became increasingly desiccated. The creek that normally provided natural fire breaks had been dry for over a month, its bed cracked and filled with dead vegetation that would burn like tinder. The mountain slopes that rose dramatically behind the residential areas were carpeted with drought-stressed trees and shrubs that had been dropping leaves and branches all summer, creating layers of fuel that would accelerate any fire's advance. As she worked in her garden, Margaret noticed her neighbors beginning their own preparations for what everyone hoped would be another false alarm. The Hendersons next door were hosing down their roof and clearing leaves from their gutters, while across the street, the Patels were loading their car with important documents and family photographs. These rituals had become routine during fire season, performed with the kind of resigned efficiency that comes from living under constant threat. Margaret's own preparations went deeper than those of her neighbors, reflecting both her knowledge of plant medicine and her understanding of how quickly normal systems could break down during emergencies. Over the past month, she had systematically harvested and processed dozens of medicinal plants, creating concentrated tinctures and dried preparations that could address common health issues if the town became isolated from outside medical resources. Her pantry now resembled a natural pharmacy, with carefully labeled jars of willow bark extract for pain relief, echinacea tincture for immune support, and valerian root preparations for anxiety and sleep disorders. She had also created detailed evacuation protocols for her most valuable plants, identifying which species were irreplaceable and could be quickly transported if she needed to leave her property. Rare specimens that had taken years to establish were potted in containers that could be loaded into her truck, while she had distributed seeds and cuttings of other important plants to trusted contacts in safer locations. The work had felt almost paranoid at the time, but now, with the atmosphere charged with impending disaster, Margaret was grateful for her thoroughness. The first sign of actual danger came at 10:30 in the morning, when the emergency sirens that marked each hour during fire season were joined by a continuous wail that meant immediate threat. Margaret was in her greenhouse, preparing a batch of burn salve from calendula and comfrey, when the sound froze her blood. She had heard this alarm tested dozens of times, but never deployed it in an actual emergency. The reality of it was somehow both louder and more terrifying than she had expected. Her phone buzzed with an emergency alert. Wildfire reported in Cascade Creek drainage. Residents of evacuation zones A and B prepare for possible immediate evacuation. Margaret's property fell within Zone B, the second tier of areas that would be evacuated if the fire continued to grow. She looked out her greenhouse windows toward the mountains, expecting to see smoke, but the air remained clear except for the strange haze that had persisted all morning. Margaret shut off the heat under her salve preparation and began implementing the evacuation procedures she had rehearsed mentally dozens of times. Her truck, a reliable Ford that she had chosen specifically for its cargo capacity, was already packed with emergency supplies, including her most important plant medicine preparations, seed collections, and research documentation. Now she began loading the portable plants she had identified as irreplaceable, working with swift efficiency while monitoring her emergency radio for updates. The fire department's initial reports painted a concerning but not immediately catastrophic picture. A small wildfire had been spotted in the steep terrain about 15 miles northeast of town, apparently started by a fallen power line during the night. Early reconnaissance suggested it was burning in heavy timber with difficult access for firefighting equipment. Under normal conditions, such a fire might be contained quickly through aerial attack and ground crews. But today's weather conditions were anything but normal. Margaret continued her preparations while listening to the emergency broadcasts, noting the increasing tension in the voices of fire officials as they described the fire's behavior. What had started as a small vegetation fire was already exhibiting signs of extreme fire behavior, with flame lengths exceeding normal parameters and spot fires appearing ahead of the main burn. The technical language couldn't disguise the fact that this fire was not responding to initial suppression efforts. By noon, the emergency broadcasts were using terminology that sent chills through anyone familiar with wildfire behavior. The fire had grown to over 500 acres and was being driven by erratic winds that were making aerial attack dangerous. Ground crews were being pulled back from direct attack due to safety concerns, and incident commanders were requesting additional resources from throughout the state. Margaret realized that this was no longer a routine fire that would be quickly controlled. She finished loading her truck and began a final walkthrough of her house, gathering personal items that couldn't be replaced and ensuring that all gas appliances were shut off. The process felt surreal, like preparing for a vacation to a destination she hoped never to reach. Her emergency bag contained medications, important documents, and enough supplies to last several days, but she found herself hesitating over items that represented her connection to this place she had come to love. The photograph of her grandmother in the herb garden behind their San Francisco apartment went into the bag, along with her great-aunt's field journals and the pressed flower collection that documented decades of botanical observations. Her grandmother's mortar and pestle, worn smooth by generations of use, wrapped carefully in a kitchen towel. These items had no monetary value but represented the continuation of knowledge and tradition that Margaret felt responsible for preserving. As she worked, Margaret could hear her neighbors making similar preparations, their voices carrying across the unusually still air. Children were being called inside from their play, and she could see families loading cars with varying degrees of urgency. Some people seemed to be treating the evacuation warning as another drill, moving slowly and stopping to chat with neighbors. Others, perhaps those with more experience of wildfire, worked with focused intensity that suggested they understood the potential seriousness of the situation. Margaret fell into the latter category, driven by instincts honed during her military-adjacent work in environmental disaster zones. She had seen how quickly situations could deteriorate when natural forces exceeded human ability to control them. The combination of extreme weather conditions and difficult terrain meant that this fire had the potential to grow far beyond what local resources could handle, potentially threatening the entire Phoenix Valley area. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the fire had grown to over 2,000 acres and was being classified as a major incident, requiring state-level resource coordination. Margaret's evacuation zone was upgraded to evacuation warning, meaning residents should be prepared to leave immediately if conditions worsened. She moved her truck to the street, ready for instant departure, and began a final check of her garden to ensure that all watering systems were functioning in case the fire approached her property. Walking through the medicinal plant beds she had spent 5 years developing, Margaret felt a profound sadness that went beyond concern for her personal loss. Many of the plants growing here existed nowhere else in the region, rare species that she had rescued from development sites or propagated from seeds provided by indigenous knowledge keepers. If the fire reached her property, decades of conservation work could be destroyed in minutes. She paused at a small grove of Pacific yew trees that she had planted near the back of her property, their bark containing compounds that pharmaceutical companies synthesized into cancer treatment drugs. These trees grew slowly and would take decades to replace if destroyed. Near them, a patch of ghost pipe, a rare parasitic plant that grew in deep forest conditions, represented years of careful habitat management to create the precise conditions it required. Margaret touched the bark of the largest yew tree, feeling the solid reality of its trunk against her palm. "Stay safe," she whispered, acknowledging the irrationality of talking to plants while simultaneously believing they might somehow understand her concern. Her grandmother had taught her that all living things were connected by invisible networks of communication and mutual support. Science was beginning to document some of these connections, particularly the chemical signals that trees used to warn each other of threats, but Margaret's relationship with plants went beyond what research could currently explain. The afternoon emergency briefing, broadcast live from the County Emergency Operations Center, confirmed Margaret's worst fears about the fire's potential. The blaze had now grown to over 5,000 acres and was being driven by winds that were shifting direction unpredictably, making it difficult for firefighters to establish effective containment lines. Incident commanders were describing the fire behavior as unprecedented and requesting additional resources from as far away as Nevada and Oregon. More ominously, the fire was burning in areas that hadn't experienced major burns in over a century, meaning the forest contained enormous accumulations of dead and dying vegetation that could fuel extremely hot, fast-moving flames. Computer modeling suggested that under current weather conditions, the fire could potentially grow to over 50,000 acres within 24 hours, threatening multiple communities throughout the region. Margaret listened to these reports while making final preparations in her garden, harvesting plants that might be useful for treating injuries or health problems during an extended evacuation. She filled several containers with fresh herbs that could be quickly prepared into teas or poultices, focusing on species that would be most helpful for smoke inhalation, minor burns, and stress-related symptoms that commonly occurred during disasters. Her work was interrupted by the sound of vehicles moving through her neighborhood with unusual urgency. Looking up from her harvesting, she saw a convoy of fire department and sheriff's vehicles moving toward the mountain areas where the fire was burning. The sight of so many emergency vehicles suggested that the situation was escalating beyond what local resources could handle independently. Margaret's phone buzzed with another emergency alert, this one more urgent than the previous. Warnings. Evacuation order issued for zones A and B. Leave immediately via Highway 49 South. Do not delay. The message was followed by automated phone calls from the county emergency system, emphasizing that residents should evacuate immediately and not attempt to defend their properties. The evacuation order removed any remaining uncertainty about the fire's seriousness. Margaret loaded her final container of medicinal plants into her truck, took a last look at her garden, and drove slowly down her street toward the main evacuation route. Other residents were emerging from their houses with varying degrees of preparation, some moving efficiently toward packed vehicles, while others seemed to be just beginning to understand the urgency of the situation. Traffic on Highway 49 moved slowly but steadily as hundreds of vehicles joined the exodus from the threatened areas. Margaret found herself in a line of cars, trucks, and RVs carrying the displaced residents of Phoenix Valley and surrounding communities. Some vehicles were loaded so heavily with possessions that their suspensions sagged visibly, while others carried only a few hastily gathered bags. The diversity of preparation levels suggested that many people had been caught off guard by the fire's rapid development. As she drove, Margaret could see smoke beginning to rise from the mountains behind Phoenix Valley, confirming that the fire was much larger and closer than the morning's reports had suggested. The smoke column was dark and thick, indicating that the fire was burning intensely in heavy vegetation. Occasional flashes of orange suggested that the flames were large enough to be visible, even from a distance of several miles. The evacuation route took the convoy through several smaller communities that were also under evacuation orders, adding more vehicles to the growing stream of displaced residents. At each intersection, sheriff's deputies directed traffic and provided updates about road conditions and available shelter locations. The efficiency of the evacuation process suggested that local authorities had learned from previous fire experiences, but the scale of the current emergency was clearly stretching resources thin. Margaret's destination was the county fairgrounds. In Pine Ridge, a community about 30 miles south of Phoenix Valley, that was serving as the primary evacuation center. The facility had been chosen because it offered large parking areas for vehicles and livestock, covered pavilions that could house evacuees, and kitchen facilities that could provide meals for hundreds of people. Red Cross volunteers were coordinating with county emergency management to provide sleeping accommodations, medical care, and communication services for displaced residents. The drive to Pine Ridge normally took about 40 minutes, but the evacuation traffic stretched the journey to nearly 2 hours. Margaret used the time to monitor emergency radio broadcasts, learning that the fire had now grown to over 8,000 acres and was threatening multiple communities beyond Phoenix Valley. Mutual aid agreements were bringing firefighting resources from throughout California and neighboring states, but the extreme fire behavior was making suppression efforts extremely dangerous. Arriving at the Pine Ridge Fairgrounds in late afternoon, Margaret joined hundreds of other evacuees in the process of registering with Red Cross volunteers and setting up temporary accommodations. The scene was both chaotic and remarkably organized, with different areas designated for families with children, elderly residents who needed medical monitoring, and pet owners who had brought animals. Margaret's truck, loaded with plants and botanical supplies, drew curious glances but no official questions as she parked in an area designated for larger vehicles. The evacuation center buzzed with anxious energy as people tried to process the sudden disruption of their normal lives. Some evacuees seemed to be treating the situation as an uncomfortable camping trip, setting up elaborate temporary living arrangements and socializing with neighbors they rarely spoke to under normal circumstances. Others sat quietly by themselves, staring toward the mountains where smoke was now clearly visible, processing the possibility that their homes and possessions might not survive the night. Margaret found herself assigned to a cot in one of the pavilions, surrounded by other single adults who had evacuated without family groups. Her neighbors included an elderly man who had brought only a small suitcase and spent most of his time trying to call relatives on a cell phone with spotty service, and a young woman with 2 cats who seemed overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster unfolding around them. As evening approached, the evacuation center took on the atmosphere of a displaced community, trying to recreate normal social functions under extraordinary circumstances. Volunteer cooks served dinner in the main pavilion while children played games in designated areas supervised by Red Cross volunteers. Local churches had sent volunteers to provide emotional support and help evacuees contact family members in other areas. Margaret ate dinner quietly while listening to conversations around her that revealed the diverse ways people were processing the emergency. Some evacuees expressed confidence that the fire would be quickly controlled and they would return home within a few days. Others seemed to understand that they might be displaced for weeks or months, depending on how the fire developed and what damage it caused to homes and infrastructure. The evening fire briefing, broadcast live from the Incident Command Center, delivered news that silenced the dinner conversations and focused everyone's attention on the emergency officials' increasingly grim assessment. The fire had grown to over 15,000 acres and was burning with such intensity that it was creating its own weather patterns, including fire-generated thunderstorms that were producing lightning and erratic winds that made firefighting extremely dangerous. Even more concerning, the fire had jumped several natural barriers that firefighters had hoped would help contain it, including roads and creeks that normally served as effective fire breaks. Multiple spot fires were being reported ahead of the main burn, suggesting that burning embers were being carried several miles by the intense convection currents created by the fire's extreme heat. Computer modeling now suggested that the fire could potentially grow to over 100,000 acres within the next 48 hours, threatening dozens of communities throughout the region. Incident commanders were requesting additional evacuations for areas that had previously been considered safe, and several major highways were being closed due to dangerous fire conditions. Margaret listened to these updates with growing concern, not just for her own property, but for the broader implications of such a massive disaster. Phoenix Valley's hospital had been evacuated along with the residential areas, meaning that medical care for the displaced population was now concentrated in facilities that were already being stretched thin by the influx of evacuees. If the fire continued to grow and threaten additional communities, the region's healthcare system could quickly become overwhelmed. She began thinking about the medicinal plants she had brought with her, wondering if her knowledge might become relevant in ways she had never anticipated. The evacuation center had basic medical facilities staffed by Red Cross volunteers and a few medical professionals who had volunteered their services. But serious medical emergencies would still need to be transported to hospitals that were now much farther away than usual. Margaret's expertise might prove useful for treating minor injuries and stress-related symptoms that didn't require professional medical intervention, but could significantly impact people's comfort and well-being. During an extended displacement, many of the evacuees were elderly residents who were dealing with chronic health conditions that might be exacerbated by the stress and disrupted routines of evacuation life. As night fell over the fairgrounds, Margaret found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. The air conditioning in the pavilion provided relief from the heat, but couldn't filter out the smell of smoke that had begun to permeate everything. Outside, the glow of the fire was now visible against the night sky, an orange dome of light that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent energy. She walked outside to check on her truck and the plants she had brought with her, finding that several other evacuees were also wandering around the fairgrounds, too anxious to rest. The mood had shifted significantly since the evening briefing, with more people beginning to understand that this was not a temporary inconvenience, but potentially a life-changing disaster. Margaret struck up a conversation with an elderly woman named Ruth who had evacuated from the same area of Phoenix Valley. Ruth was dealing with arthritis that had been aggravated by sleeping on an unfamiliar cot, and mentioned that she had forgotten to bring her prescription pain medication in the rush to evacuate. The pharmacies in Pine Ridge were overwhelmed with evacuees trying to replace medications, and Ruth's doctor's office had been evacuated along with the rest of Phoenix Valley. Without thinking about the potential complications, Margaret offered to prepare a willow bark tea that might help with Ruth's joint pain. She explained that willow bark contained natural compounds similar to aspirin, and that it had been used for centuries to treat inflammatory conditions. Ruth was grateful for any relief, and Margaret found herself brewing tea over a small camp stove she had packed with her emergency supplies. Word of Margaret's herbal knowledge spread quickly through the evacuation center, as evacuees dealing with various minor health issues began seeking her out for advice. An elderly man with diabetes mentioned that the stress of evacuation was affecting his blood sugar levels, and Margaret suggested a cinnamon tea that might help stabilize his glucose metabolism. A mother with young children asked about natural remedies for the respiratory irritation her family was experiencing from smoke exposure, and Margaret prepared a steam inhalation using eucalyptus and peppermint that she had harvested that morning. Each interaction was carefully bounded by Margaret's understanding of appropriate limits for herbal recommendations. She emphasized that plant medicines were supportive therapies, not replacements for professional medical care, and she encouraged anyone with serious symptoms to seek evaluation from the Red Cross medical volunteers. But for minor discomforts that were making evacuation life more difficult, her plant knowledge provided relief that wasn't available through conventional channels. By the second day of evacuation, Margaret had become an unofficial resource for evacuees dealing with stress, minor injuries, and the various health challenges that arose from disrupted routines and unfamiliar living conditions. Her supplies of prepared herbal medicines were being depleted quickly, but the fresh plants she had brought allowed her to continue preparing new batches of teas and topical applications as needed. The fire continued to grow, now covering over 30,000 acres and destroying hundreds of structures throughout the region. Phoenix Valley itself had not yet been directly impacted by flames, but the entire community remained under evacuation orders as firefighters worked to establish containment lines that might protect the residential areas. The uncertainty about when residents might be able to return home was creating additional stress for evacuees who were trying to maintain some semblance of normal life while their future remained completely unpredictable. Margaret's herbal practice at the evacuation center was attracting attention from Red Cross volunteers and other medical personnel, who were impressed by her knowledge and the positive responses she was getting from evacuees who used her preparations. Dr. Sandra Martinez, a retired physician who was volunteering at the center, approached Margaret to learn more about her background and training. Dr. Martinez had experience with integrative medicine approaches that combined CONVENT-IONL treatments with evidence-based complementary therapies, and she was curious about Margaret's plant knowledge. After learning about Margaret's academic background in botany and biochemistry, as well as her careful approach to safety and contraindications, Dr. Martinez suggested that they might work together to provide more comprehensive care for evacuees who were dealing with stress-related health issues. The collaboration with Dr. Martinez legitimized Margaret's work in ways that allowed her to help more evacuees while maintaining appropriate medical oversight. Together, they developed protocols for using herbal preparations to address common evacuation-related health challenges, including anxiety, sleep disorders, digestive problems, and minor respiratory irritation from smoke exposure. Margaret's transformation from community-eccentric to essential resource was happening gradually, as more evacuees experienced the benefits of her plant medicines, and word spread about her knowledge and generosity. People who had dismissed her as a harmless oddity in normal times were now seeking her out for help with problems that conventional medicine couldn't easily address in the evacuation center's limited medical facilities. The irony was not lost on Margaret that the same knowledge her community had ridiculed just months earlier was now providing comfort and healing to people who had no other options. But rather than feeling vindicated, she found herself focused entirely on meeting the immediate needs of displaced people who were facing unprecedented challenges to their health and well-being. As the fire entered its fourth day and showed no signs of slowing down, Margaret realized that her role as an herbal healer might be just the beginning of how this disaster would transform her relationship with Phoenix Valley. The community that emerged from this crisis would be different from the one that had existed before, shaped by shared experiences of loss and mutual dependence that could either strengthen social bonds or create new divisions, based on who had helped and who had failed to help when help was needed most. The morning of the seventh day brought news that would forever change how Phoenix Valley viewed both natural disasters and the quiet woman who had spent years cultivating what others dismissed as weeds. Margaret woke before dawn in the evacuation center, her internal clock still attuned to the rhythms of tending plants despite sleeping on a cot surrounded by hundreds of displaced neighbors. The air carried a sharp chemical smell that hadn't been present the night before, something acrid and wrong that made her throat burn with each breath. Emergency sirens were wailing continuously now, not the hourly tests that residents had grown accustomed to, but the relentless alarm that meant immediate danger to human life. Margaret dressed quickly and walked outside to find the eastern horizon glowing with an unnatural orange light that spoke of destruction on a scale she had never witnessed. The fire had jumped the final containment lines during the night and was now racing toward populated areas with a ferocity that made evacuation centers seem inadequately distant from the danger. Dr. Martinez found Margaret near the medical tent, both women staring toward the mountains where their community was burning. "We've got bigger problems than smoke inhalation now," Dr. Martinez said grimly, holding up her emergency radio. "That's not just wildfire smoke anymore. The flames reached the Cascade chemical plant about 2 hours ago. We're looking at a toxic plume that's going to affect air quality for hundreds of miles." Margaret felt her blood turn cold as she processed the implications. The Cascade facility manufactured agricultural pesticides and industrial solvents, storing thousands of gallons of chemicals that were now being released into the atmosphere through combustion. The resulting toxic smoke would create health hazards far beyond what anyone had prepared for, potentially causing respiratory damage, skin irritation, and systemic poisoning in anyone exposed to significant concentrations. The evacuation center erupted into controlled chaos as emergency officials attempted to manage a crisis that had suddenly expanded beyond their worst-case scenarios. Additional evacuations were being ordered for communities that had been considered safe, while medical facilities throughout the region were being warned to prepare for mass casualties from chemical exposure. The Pine Ridge Evacuation Center, now housing over 2,000 displaced people, was directly in the path of the toxic plume. Margaret watched as Red Cross volunteers and emergency personnel struggled to implement protocols that had never been tested under such extreme conditions. The center's medical facilities, adequate for treating minor injuries and stress-related symptoms, were completely unprepared for potential chemical poisoning on a massive scale. The nearest hospital with appropriate equipment for treating toxic exposure was over 100 miles away, far beyond the reach of people who were already suffering respiratory distress. Dr. Martinez pulled Margaret aside as evacuation center officials began discussing the possibility of moving everyone to facilities even farther from the fire zone. "We need to talk about plant medicine options," she said urgently. "If that toxic cloud reaches us before we can evacuate again, we're going to have thousands of people with chemical exposure and no way to treat them conventionally. What do you have that might help with detoxification and respiratory protection?" Margaret's mind raced through decades of botanical knowledge, remembering her grandmother's stories about traditional remedies used during industrial accidents in Korea, and her own research into plants that could support the body's natural detoxification processes. Several species in her emergency supplies had documented abilities to help the liver process toxins more efficiently, while others could provide respiratory protection by reducing inflammation and supporting mucous membrane healing. "Milk thistle for liver support," Margaret said, already mentally inventorying her supplies. "Red clover and burdock root for blood purification. Pine needle tea has compounds that can help protect lung tissue from chemical damage. And activated charcoal from willow bark can help absorb toxins in the digestive system." She paused, realizing the enormity of what Dr. Martinez was asking. "But we'd need massive quantities to treat everyone here, and some of these preparations take hours to make properly." Dr. Martinez nodded grimly. "Start with what you have, and tell me what you need to make more. I'm going to talk to the emergency coordinator about declaring a medical emergency that would allow us to use unconventional treatments." She looked toward the approaching smoke cloud, now visibly darker and more chemical-laden than natural wildfire smoke. "Because conventional medicine isn't going to help us if that cloud reaches us in the next few hours." Margaret sprinted to her truck and began pulling out every container of prepared herbal medicines she had brought from her garden. Tinctures, dried herbs, and fresh plant materials that she had harvested a week ago now represented potentially life-saving resources for thousands of people facing chemical exposure. She began calculating dosages and preparation methods while Dr. Martinez worked to convince emergency officials that desperate times called for desperate measures. The breakthrough came when satellite imagery confirmed that the toxic cloud was moving faster than evacuation efforts could accommodate. With over 2,000 people at the Pine Ridge Center and thousands more at other facilities throughout the region, there simply wasn't enough transportation to move everyone to safe areas before the contaminated air arrived. Emergency officials faced the terrible choice between attempting mass evacuation on roads that were already congested with fleeing residents, or sheltering in place and hoping that indoor air filtration would provide adequate protection. Dr. Martinez's proposal to supplement conventional emergency medical care with herbal detoxification support suddenly seemed less like alternative medicine experimentation and more like practical crisis management. The evacuation center's emergency coordinator, a veteran of multiple disaster responses, authorized Dr. Martinez to implement any medical interventions she deemed appropriate for protecting public health. Margaret found herself at the center of the largest herbal medicine operation in the region's history, coordinating with Red Cross volunteers and medical personnel to prepare plant-based treatments for thousands of people. The process required adapting traditional preparation methods to work with emergency equipment and volunteer labor, creating standardized protocols that could be safely implemented by people with no botanical training. Working with feverish efficiency, Margaret directed teams of volunteers in preparing massive batches of protective teas and detoxification supplements. Pine needles were harvested from trees around the fairgrounds and steeped in large commercial coffee urns to create respiratory protective tea. Milk thistle seeds were ground in food processors and mixed with honey to make liver-supporting supplements that even children could take safely. The work took on an almost military precision as Margaret drew on organizational skills she had developed during her research career, creating assembly lines for different preparations and training volunteers to recognize quality indicators and safety concerns. Dr. Martinez provided medical oversight and helped establish dosage guidelines that balanced therapeutic benefit with safety considerations for the diverse population of evacuees. As the first wisps of chemical-tainted smoke began reaching the evacuation center, Margaret's herbal medicines were being distributed to everyone in the facility. Families huddled in the sealed pavilions, drinking pine needle tea and taking milk. Thistle supplements, while emergency air filtration systems struggled to keep pace with the toxic atmosphere outside. The strange combination of cutting-edge, emergency management technology and ancient plant medicine created a surreal atmosphere that felt both desperate and hopeful. Margaret moved through the crowded pavilions, monitoring how people were responding to the herbal treatments and adjusting preparations based on individual needs. Elderly evacuees with compromised respiratory systems received stronger concentrations of anti-inflammatory herbs, while children got milder preparations designed to support their developing detoxification systems without overwhelming their smaller bodies. The first real test of Margaret's crisis medicine came when a family of 4 arrived at the evacuation center after being caught in the toxic cloud during a failed evacuation attempt. They were suffering from severe respiratory irritation, skin burns from chemical exposure, and the kind of systemic symptoms that indicated significant toxic absorption. The center's conventional medical supplies could provide symptomatic relief, but nothing to address the underlying chemical poisoning. Dr. Martinez and Margaret worked together to create an intensive detoxification protocol that combined emergency medical stabilization with aggressive herbal support for the body's natural healing processes. Activated charcoal prepared from Margaret's willow bark supplies helped absorb toxins in the digestive system, while topical applications of calendula and comfrey provided relief for chemical burns. Respiratory steam treatments using eucalyptus and pine helped clear damaged lung tissue and reduce inflammation. Within hours, the family showed marked improvement in their symptoms, breathing more easily and reporting significant reduction in the burning sensations that had made them miserable since their exposure. Word of their recovery spread quickly through the evacuation center, creating a demand for Margaret's herbal treatments that far exceeded her available supplies. Margaret found herself facing the same resource limitations that had plagued conventional medical responses to the crisis. But with an important difference: many of the plants she needed were growing wild around the evacuation center and throughout the region. Working with teams of volunteers, she began organized foraging expeditions to gather medicinal plants from areas that hadn't been contaminated by the toxic smoke. The foraging teams, led by evacuees who had learned plant identification from Margaret's impromptu teaching sessions, spread out across Pine Ridge and surrounding areas to collect the raw materials needed for continuing the herbal medicine operation. Red clover grew in abandoned fields, burdock flourished along roadsides, and pine trees provided endless supplies of needles for respiratory protective tea. Margaret's transformation from community outcast to essential leader reached its peak as she coordinated these foraging efforts while simultaneously managing the preparation and distribution of herbal medicines for thousands of people. Local officials who had dismissed her plant knowledge just weeks earlier now deferred to her expertise in matters that were literally life and death for their constituents. The scale of the operation attracted attention from emergency management agencies throughout California, as news of the successful herbal medicine response to chemical exposure spread through official channels. Margaret found herself briefing state-level disaster officials about her protocols and providing training materials that could be used at other evacuation centers facing similar challenges. 3 days into the chemical crisis, independent air Quality testing confirmed what everyone at the Pine Ridge Center already knew. Margaret's herbal medicines were making a measurable difference in how well people were tolerating exposure to toxic air. Evacuees who had access to her plant-based treatments showed significantly lower rates of respiratory complications, faster recovery from chemical exposure symptoms, and better overall health outcomes compared to populations at other evacuation centers. The validation came not just from official testing, but from the lived experiences of thousands of people who had experienced firsthand how plant medicine could provide protection and healing during environmental disasters. Families who had arrived at the center suffering from toxic exposure were now helping to prepare herbal medicines for newcomers. Children who had initially refused the strange-tasting teas were asking for them by name when they felt respiratory irritation from lingering chemical contamination. Margaret's relationship with Dr. Martinez deepened into a true collaborative partnership as they worked together to document their crisis medicine protocols and train other medical personnel in integrating herbal treatments with conventional emergency care. Their work was creating a new model for disaster medicine that recognized the value of traditional plant knowledge alongside modern medical technology. The collaboration extended beyond immediate crisis response as Margaret and Dr. Martinez began planning for long-term health support for people who had experienced significant chemical exposure. Many evacuees would need ongoing detoxification support for months or years after the initial crisis, and the conventional medical system was not equipped to provide the kind of comprehensive care that would optimize their recovery. Margaret's expertise in long-term herbal protocols suddenly became relevant not just for a few interested individuals, but for entire communities that would need sustained support for chemical-induced health problems. Her detailed knowledge of how different plants supported various aspects of detoxification and healing positioned her as an essential resource for post-disaster community health planning. The fire itself finally began to come under control after 2 weeks of unprecedented destruction, but the chemical contamination had created health challenges that would persist long after the flames were extinguished. Hundreds of square miles of agricultural land were contaminated with toxic residues. Water sources required extensive testing and treatment, and thousands of people needed ongoing medical monitoring for the effects of chemical exposure. Margaret's role in the community's recovery planning reflected her complete transformation from marginalized eccentric to recognized expert whose knowledge was essential for public health and safety. Local officials who had laughed at her proposals for medicinal plant gardens now sought her advice on how to remediate contaminated agricultural land using plants that could help extract toxins from soil and water. Her expertise in phytoremediation, the use of plants to clean up environmental contamination, became crucial as Phoenix Valley began planning its recovery from the chemical disaster. Certain species could absorb heavy metals and toxic compounds from contaminated soil, slowly cleaning the land while producing biomass that could be safely disposed of through controlled processing. Margaret worked with environmental engineers and agricultural specialists to design phytoremediation systems that would restore the valley's agricultural productivity while simultaneously creating new sources of medicinal plants that could support ongoing community health needs. The integration of ecological restoration with community health planning represented exactly the kind of holistic thinking that her plant knowledge had always embodied. The personal vindication of seeing her expertise recognized and valued was deeply satisfying, but Margaret found herself more focused on the opportunities to build long-term community resilience that the crisis had created. People who had experienced the life-saving benefits of plant medicine during the chemical emergency were now interested in learning how to grow and prepare their own herbal medicines for future use. Margaret began organizing community education programs that taught practical plant medicine skills to residents who wanted to be better prepared for future emergencies. The programs attracted participants from across the economic and social spectrum of Phoenix Valley, creating connections between people who might never have interacted under normal circumstances. The shared experience of surviving an unprecedented disaster while relying on ancient plant wisdom created a sense of community solidarity that transcended the social divisions that had characterized Phoenix Valley before the fire. People who had been skeptical of alternative medicine found themselves growing medicinal herbs in their rebuilt gardens, while others who had never considered emergency preparedness began learning about plants that could provide health support during infrastructure disruptions. Margaret's shop, Wild Root Botanicals, was destroyed in the fire along with most of Phoenix Valley's historic downtown district. But the demand for her knowledge and products had grown exponentially, creating opportunities to rebuild on a much larger scale than had ever been possible before the disaster. Community leaders approached her about establishing a larger facility that could serve as both a retail operation and an educational center for plant medicine and environmental sustainability. The new facility, planned as part of Phoenix Valley's downtown reconstruction, would include greenhouse space for propagating rare medicinal plants, classroom areas for teaching botanical skills, and laboratory facilities for developing and testing herbal preparations. The project represented everything Margaret had dreamed of during her years of working in isolation, but on a scale that would serve the entire region rather than just a small group of interested individuals. More importantly, the new center would be integrated with the community's emergency preparedness planning, ensuring that future disasters would find Phoenix Valley equipped with both the plant medicines and the knowledge needed to provide effective crisis health care. Margaret's protocols for emergency herbal medicine had been adopted by state disaster management agencies and were being taught to emergency responders throughout California. The transformation extended to Margaret's personal relationships within the community, as people who had dismissed her as an eccentric now sought her friendship and guidance. Dr. Hawthorne, who had been one of her most vocal critics, approached Margaret with a request for collaboration on a research project studying the long-term health outcomes of chemical exposure survivors who had received herbal medicine treatment. The research collaboration represented more than professional recognition. It acknowledged that Margaret's plant knowledge constituted a legitimate form of medical expertise that deserved scientific validation and integration with conventional healthcare systems. Dr. Hawthorne's willingness to work with Margaret also demonstrated how the crisis had changed community attitudes toward alternative approaches to health and healing. Margaret's relationship with Derek Walsh, the councilman, who had mocked her original emergency preparedness proposal, underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation. His own family had been among those who benefited significantly from Margaret's herbal treatments during the chemical crisis, and he had witnessed firsthand how her knowledge had provided healing when conventional medicine was overwhelmed. Councilman Walsh publicly apologized for his dismissive treatment of Margaret's original proposal and became one of the strongest advocates for including traditional plant knowledge in Phoenix Valley's rebuilding plans. His support proved crucial for securing funding for the new Botanical Medicine Center and for establishing policies that recognized herbal practitioners as legitimate healthcare providers under certain circumstances. The broader implications of Margaret's success extended far beyond Phoenix Valley, as her crisis medicine protocols attracted attention from disaster preparedness agencies, medical schools, and indigenous communities working to preserve traditional healing knowledge. She found herself invited to speak at conferences, contribute to research publications, and consult with organizations developing community resilience programs. Margaret's grandmother's wisdom about plants waiting for people to be ready to listen had proven prophetic in ways that neither of them could have imagined. The crisis that had threatened to destroy Phoenix Valley had also created the conditions for ancient plant knowledge to be recognized as essential for modern community survival and health. The rebuilt Phoenix Valley that emerged from the ashes of the fire was fundamentally different from the community that had existed before the disaster. Gardens throughout the town now included medicinal plants alongside decorative flowers, and many residents had basic knowledge of how to prepare herbal medicines for common health challenges. The community's emergency preparedness plans included detailed protocols for using local plant resources to supplement conventional medical care during infrastructure disruptions. Margaret's own garden, rebuilt on her original property with expanded greenhouse facilities and improved water systems, became a destination for visitors from throughout the region who wanted to learn about medicinal plants and sustainable living practices. The space served multiple functions as a production facility for herbal medicines, a research site for studying plant cultivation techniques, and an educational center where anyone could learn practical botanical skills. The integration of plant medicine into Phoenix Valley's identity attracted new residents and businesses that were interested in sustainable living and alternative health approaches. The community's reputation for innovation in disaster preparedness and community resilience drew attention from urban planners, environmental scientists, and public health researchers who were studying how traditional knowledge could be adapted for modern community needs. Margaret found herself living in a community that not only accepted her plant knowledge, but celebrated it as a source of local pride and identity. The woman who had once been dismissed as an eccentric plant lady was now recognized as a community treasure whose expertise had literally saved lives and whose vision was shaping the future of her town. The personal satisfaction of seeing her knowledge valued and her community transformed was profound. But Margaret remained focused on the ongoing work of building resilience and sustainability that would serve future generations. The disaster had taught everyone that normal systems could fail catastrophically, and that communities needed diverse sources of knowledge and resources to survive unprecedented challenges. Margaret's story became a testament to the value of preserving traditional knowledge and maintaining connections to the natural world, even when such practices seemed outdated or irrelevant. Her experience demonstrated that ancient wisdom and modern innovation could work together to create solutions that neither approach could achieve independently. As Phoenix Valley continued its recovery and rebuilding process, Margaret's role as a bridge between traditional plant knowledge and contemporary community needs ensured that the lessons learned during the crisis would not be forgotten. Her work represented more than individual vindication. It demonstrated how communities could become stronger and more resilient by embracing diverse forms of knowledge and expertise. The quiet woman who had once been laughed at for talking about weeds had become the architect of a new model for community health and environmental sustainability that was being studied and replicated throughout the region. Her plant medicine had not only saved her community during its darkest hour, but had planted seeds for a future where ancient wisdom and modern innovation could flourish together in harmony. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.